Hi everyone, good afternoon, bonjour à tous. Thank you for being so many on this Zoom for the conversation around the book Mutinous Woman, written by Joan DeJean. Let me introduce me very quickly. I'm Isabelle Leroux. I'm a board member of the Alliance Française Miami Metro, and I'm also the new president of the Fédération Alliance Française USA, honored to succeed to Linda Witt. This program was prepared by René Ketcham, president of l'Alliance Française Greenwich, and vice president of the Federation Board, chair of the Cultural Offering, and Melissa Sora, our national coordinator. Part of the Federation Cultural program, you can see that very soon we have a Marcel Proust event. It's a Proust exhibition tour live from Paris. Be careful, this program is fully in French. We also have something about bande dessinée française, so it's going to be gorgeous with Damien MacDonald. And after, as holiday season is around the corner, you have free cooking class in a row. We also have, it was a last minute program, but we are so honored to welcome Kauter Adimi, and it's going to be on November 29th. So if you want to have more information about our network, you know that we represent all the Alliance Française US chapter, and we are very proud about that. We have a website, afusa.org. You can find all the information and all what we propose tools, webinar, a large range of events, and you are all more than welcome. But today, it's time, logistic format, very important. Please stay on mute during the presentation and on speaker view. If you have questions, put your question in the chat, and Melissa, if Joan is on time, we may have a 10 minutes Q&A. So Melissa and I will check the chat, and we will pick some of your questions. If you have technical issues, you sign back, you wait a little bit, a couple of minutes, and you can re-enter on the Zoom. You use the same link, same login, same password. And for your information, the event is recorded on our YouTube channel. The format is 1 hour, so we may be done for 3 p.m. Thank you so much for your participation. So now it's time to welcome Joan DeJean. Joan is very familiar with the Alliance Française network. It's not the first time that she's our guest, and we are very honored to have her this afternoon. Joan, you are a trustee professor at the University of Pennsylvania. You previously taught at Yale and Princeton. You are the author of 12 books on French literature, history, and material culture on the 17th and 18th centuries. As you grew up in Louisiana, fast French was part of your life. But today, you're not the only guest. We have amazing guests. We have the Gutman family. Thank you so much to all the Gutman family for being with us on the Zoom. And Joan, you're going to explain us why they are here and how they are linked. And it's an amazing story, how they are linked to your book and to the story of this deported woman from France to Louisiana. Joan, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank the Alliance for sponsoring this. I want to thank Isabelle Leroux for her introduction and her help, René Ketcham for being interested from the beginning, and to Melissa Soha, who will keep things moving for us. When I wrote the book, Mutinous Women, I wrote it with the descendants of these women in mind. My editor, as I was working on it, kept saying, how many descendants are there? And I said, I have no clue. How could I know? Today, we're lucky enough to have 5 direct descendants of one of the women, 4 descendants from the 7th generation of her descendants, and 1 from the 8th generation. And now, Melissa, if you could put the slide of the Gutman family up just for a second again, so people can see that. Yes. So this is the whole Gutman family. This is their view of their not nuclear family, but the big Gutman family. And now maybe the 5 Gutmans here today would introduce themselves so you'll have a sense of who's here before we start.
Sure. I'm Mary Lou Gutman, and I live in New York City, and I'm one of the 7th generation direct descendants.
And hi, I'm Patricia Marie Gutman, and I live in New Jersey, and I'm happily retired now.
Hi, I'm Kathy Gutman-Rikuski, and I'm another 7th generationer, and I live in New Jersey.
And I'm John Gutman. I'm same generation. Those 3 are my sisters, and I live in Washington, D.C.
And Jack.
I'm Jack. I'm the 8th generation representative here. My mom is Kathy, and these are my aunts and uncles, and happy to be here. I live in New York City.
Thank you, guys. And maybe, Melissa, you could show the slide of my book, because what I'm going to do now is a quick introduction to the book and to the story. I'm going to give the quickest introduction to this story. There'll be time for questions at the end, and truly I explain the things I'm talking about right now quickly in detail in the book. I want us to get from the story in the book to the Gutman family. That's because they are our focus today. The moment that was crucial for these women was 1718 to 1719, and the moment was in Paris. That moment, 1718 to 1719, determined the lives of many of the first French women in this country. At that time, full control over the French economy was handed over to one man, John Law. He was a Scottish economic theorist. And if you can imagine, you've got an economic theorist who's given the candy store, everything. And within a few months' time, he established the first national bank France had ever had. He established paper money. He introduced paper currency. No country in Europe had had paper currency. He introduced a stock market, trading in stock. All of this happened. And all the value of the stock, the currency, everything was based on one colony, Louisiana. And John Law sold Louisiana to the world as an El Dorado. He promised that anyone who invested would get fabulously wealthy. And for a while, the stock really shot up. While this was, it was the first stock market boom the world had ever known. While this was happening, John Law could do anything he wanted. And so at one moment, he thinks, oh, I want women for Louisiana. He got them. Corrupt Parisian police officers for money arrested women to be sent to Louisiana. In 1719, 225 female prisoners in a Parisian prison were sentenced to lifetime exile in Louisiana. 195 of them were chained together and transported in chains to the coast. 95 of them were transported in the hold of a ship called La Mutine, the mutinous woman, across the Atlantic. Approximately 60 of them survived, and they were left on the Gulf Coast. In early 1720, those women reached the Gulf Coast. One of them was the Gutman's ancestor, Mahi Doda. And if Melissa, we could have the next slide. I'm not seeing slides. I'm seeing good. Okay. This is the outline of the beginning of the life of the Gutman's ancestor, Marie Daudin. She was born her family was born in Orleans, France, which was then a small city of about 50,000. Orleans, France is defined by the river that runs through it, the Loire River, and by trade. It was a big port city at the time. And Mari's family lived right by the river, and made their living from its trade. And if we go to the next slide, please. This is the beginning of Marie Daudin's story. This is the marriage of her parents. In 1698, Charles Daudin and Marie Guérin married in Orleans. And I had the parish church, by the way, was right by the Loire River. And the priest who officiated their marriage inscribed it in the parish archives. I highlighted the words, her father's name, Charles Daudin, and what you see by it, porte-sac, sack bearer. In other words, Marie Daudin's father worked on the docks at Orléans, and he lugged heavy loads around on his back all day long. That was making a living from the river the hard way. It was also a subsistence job, basic. Their family would have lived at or below the poverty level. And let's go to the next one, please, Melissa. Next slide. 18 months after they married, birth of their first child, Marie, daughter Charles Daudin. So Marie Daudin was born in 1700 in Orleans, France, the first child of what became the oldest child in what became a large, poor family. And now I'm going to skip her childhood and go to what interests us. The next slide, Melissa, please. This is Paris. This is Marie Daudin's arrest. And I'm giving you this to show one thing. Like many of most of the women on that ship, Marie was arrested in Paris. She had come from a small city. She was living in the biggest city in Europe at the time, 700,000 people. And when she was arrested, the word I have highlighted is alibi. Alibi, alibi, same word in English. In the language of the Parisian police, it was very simple. Marie Daudin was not at the scene of the crime, as the police alleged. She was somewhere else, and she was able to prove it. Nonetheless, that arrest determined her fate. It was an unjust arrest like so many others, but because of that arrest, she found herself on that ship, the Mutinous Woman, as passenger number 166. And on February 20th, 1720, the ship landed on the Gulf Coast with Mahi Doda aboard. And that's the step that ultimately determined the Daudin's present, the Gutman's presence with us today. I knew I'd keep calling you the Daudin family, the Gutman's presence. Then we have the next slide, Melissa. They sent the women to the colony they called Louisiana. And I wanted to show you because I think people today have really no idea of how big the French territory in this country was. We don't think of it. Everything pale gray was under French control. The English is white, and the Spanish is in dark gray at the bottom. And the French controlled everything. In Louisiana was Illinois down to the Gulf Coast, across and up. And with the Mississippi, that lifeline for commerce, the French had a link to New France, the French territory in Canada. So their control was huge over all this territory. Marie was the only woman from Orleans, France, to be deported on the ship. She went straight for the capital the French were building in Louisiana, New Orleans. And when she got to New Orleans, she found a city in some ways like Orleans. Both are river ports, but the Loire is a 600-mile-long river. The Mississippi, 2,400. It's a different kind of beast. The Loire at Orleans, France, at Orléans, is 2 miles wide. The Mississippi in New Orleans is 20 to 30 miles wide, and that's narrow for the Mississippi. So Mississippi is this huge, powerful beast of a river. When she got to New Orleans, Marie married someone who, like her father, lived from the river, Antoine Michel Caron. However, it was a different kind of living. Her father lugged sacks. She married the top of the hierarchy, a ship's captain, a man who commanded ships for the French Indies Company. So that's all her life in the colony. Marie Daudin moved up. And she began it right at the start, moving immediately. Caron was one of the most important men in the colony. The French had built this new capital, or were beginning to, but they couldn't get there on the Mississippi at first. It's a tough river to navigate. Antoine Michel Caron was one of the first pilots able to navigate the Mississippi to New Orleans. So he was very important. For a few years in the 1720s, the couple lived very well in New Orleans. They lived on Bourbon Street. They had a home. They raised children. And then in the fall of 1729, Caron's ship was sent to Natchez, which you can see for Rosalie on the map. Natchez was north on the Mississippi and an important post for the French. He got there the day, on a fateful day for Natchez. The French commander of the garrison had tried to grab illegally the Natchez nation's sacred land, and the Natchez rose up against them, and there was an uprising, and they killed all the Frenchmen in the garrison, and Caron was killed as well. And now, with his death, we're getting closer to the Gutmans. So maybe we can talk to two of the Gutmans, to Mary Lou and Patricia. So Mary Lou is, I think, up first. I'm not seeing you, Mary
No,
Lou.
I'm right here.
Okay, good. I just wasn't, you weren't popping up on my, I know you were there, but I want you to be the person people saw. So Mary Lou, I met by the way, for the Gutmans this summer in Philadelphia, and I learned right away that Mary Lou is the designated keeper of the family history for this generation of the Gutman family. So can you tell us what that means to you? What do you do as the designated keeper of the family's history?
Well, it means a lot. And I became the keeper of the family history because I used to have a lot of conversations with my mother about her family history. And my mother learned it from her father and her Aunt Eliza. And they passed down various artifacts. There was oral history, there was artifacts, there were newspaper articles, photographs, and everything was kept in these metal boxes in the small metal boxes in the closet shelf, including an old diary. Well, we thought it was a diary, but including this old book.
Hold it up prominently, please, Mary Lou. We're going to see images from that book later. So I just wanted you to see that it's a real book. It's a modest 18th century book, still in its original binding. And that's been passed down in the family until today.
That's right. But that's why it was so exciting to read your book, Joan, Mutinous Women, because it brought it all to life. It also showed us the parts of the oral history that we had that were wrong. You know, they were sort of based in fact, but not exactly right. We knew we had a French lineage, but we were never sure why the family came to the United States. And we learned that through your book. And my mother would have been just thrilled.
How did they ask you to take on the role of family history, keeper of the history?
Well, my mother did, because she knew I was very interested in it. And she told me before, you know, my mother passed away, that whichever of her grandchildren has the most interest in it should get all of these artifacts and different things.
Okay, I love the fact of this. You know, I am a scholar, I work in archives. I see documents like the Gutman's book in an archive. It's different when I met them for lunch in Philadelphia and they handed it to me. You know, I've never had the past presented to me in my hands, and I was worried about the grease from my lunch getting on it. And since we're talking about the Gutman's mother, at that lunch, Patricia told me about their mother. So maybe Patricia could come on for a minute and thank you, Mary Lou, pass it on and tell us a little bit more. If we can find Patricia.
Okay, I'm right here.
Great. So Patricia, you told me stories about your mother, and you can, whenever you'd like the photo to be shown, you can ask Melissa, she'll show it.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think that reading your book made it real for me, you know, our history, or the family history. And I know that my mother would have been thrilled about the book. And there are many similarities between my mother and they involve ships. Marie Daudin traveled to New Orleans on the Mutinous Women, and it changed her life. And my mother served as a World War II Army nurse. if you'd like to show the picture, you could show the picture now.
Melissa, next.
Melissa.
Great, great. Isn't that a wonderful photo of the Gutman's mother, I think?
And here she is, a World War II Army nurse on the USS Republic, and was one of the more significant events of her life, other than marrying my father and having her children, of course. Here she is. She served in the Philippines, but by coincidence, she was stationed for 6 months on the Republic in New Orleans before they set sail for the Pacific. We're all very proud of my mother enlisting in the Army because she wanted to serve her country and fight. It showed a strength of character, which I think she must have gotten from Marie Daudin, who survived such horrible conditions in Paris and then on the journey to the colonies. I mean, we've been to, Mary Lou and I started going with my mother to New Orleans, and we saw Jack's older brother, Bard Hollis. He was at Tulane, and then we went multiple years to New Orleans to see Jack at Tulane. We went to the World War II Museum, and we have plaques with my mother's name, my father's name, and my mother's younger brother at the museum. The bricks and the stones. She was an incredible woman.
And I love that New Orleans and your mother have all stayed together in many ways, and ships, you're right. We were talking about your family history and before and now. Did you know Mahi Doda when you were growing up and all this history was being passed down?
No.
So she was not yet present. Where did the family history begin when it was passed down to? So imagine 7 generations being passed down. That's a lot of history, a lot of time. Who was the begin? Her daughter. Which one?
Constance.
Marie Catherine LaRoche.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Sorry, yeah. Got confused of which one was which.
That was the next gen. Yeah, Marie Catherine. So maybe we can move back to Mahi Doda and the second part of her history to bring it up to the part when she connected with the past as it was passed down to you. So Melissa, the next slide, please. This is the next part, the timeline of the next part of Mahi Daudin's life. In 1729, as I said, her first husband is killed in Natchez. She was a young widow, age 29, with a surviving son to support and take care of. She remarried in 1730. She waited quite a while to remarry, by the way. Most women remarried in like a month. They were so desperate. But she remarried in 1730. She married Jean Laroche. He was a widower. Like her, he had been born in France, and like her first husband, he was born in France. He had been her neighbor on Bourbon Street. So he lived next door to this couple, and Marie and her first husband on Bourbon Street. He was a master carpenter in the sense of framer. He made frames, he framed houses, he made frames for ships. This was a highly skilled, important profession. So she always married well. And he combined their 2 houses on Bourbon Street. And the next year, the woman who was, until now, the origin of the Gutman family history, Marie Catherine Laroche, was born in New Orleans, their first child, a daughter. Let's skip forward, 1747. Marie Catherine Laroche marries in New Orleans. And Melissa, if we could see the next slide, I want to show people this. This is at the end of every French marriage ceremony, you have signatures, the men, the women, everyone who's there. And you can see at the top, the men's signatures are very evolved. These are guys who really knew how to write. I wanted you to see Mahi Doda was literate, which is unusual for the daughter of a dock worker, and her daughter's signatures. And to show you a couple of things, women's literacy was usually what I describe as shallow. They knew how to write, but not really. Look at the daughter's signature, Marie Catherine. she forgot the E at the end of her name, so she sort of snuck it in. So she really didn't know how to spell her name. Otherwise, she would have spelled it correctly to start with. I can imagine her mother saying, put that E in, fill it out. But despite this, the two of them have very assertive signatures. Look at those D's on Daudin. And those are D's. She wants you to have a flourish. And the same thing for the L on La Roche. These are two women who knew their minds and who had a personality. They could affirm that personality. The bride was not quite 16, maybe the next slide, Melissa. And here, this is the book you saw a second ago, right near the end of the book. This is the first thing I saw when the Gutmans brought their book to me. This is about, and I have him highlighted, this is the groom's birth in France. The groom of that marriage, the husband of Marie Daudin's daughter, kept this book in New Orleans, and he began it with his own birth in France. So he recorded the days of his and the date and everyone present at his baptism, because he wouldn't have had that record in New Orleans. And that's when I learned something I wish I had known when I was writing the book from the Gutmans. The bride, his bride, Marie Daudin's daughter, was not quite 16. The groom was born 4 years before her mother. So this 16-year-old girl married a 51-year-old man in New Orleans. He was a well-respected fabric merchant, French-born. He was an ideal candidate, but there was a big age difference, and no one would have known that. And this is the page that shows his birth in France. And then the two of them quickly had a daughter. So we can go to the next one. I want to show another page. This is the book once again, Pierre Roval's book. He records the baptism of his daughter, which is really sweet. It's the way English speakers use Bibles, I think, to record family history. The French were not, the Catholic Church discouraged the reading of Bibles. So he's got the equivalent of this, but he's a merchant. You don't waste half a page. If any of you are interested in this, I can talk about it later. So he's got a half a page left. He's a fabric merchant. He records, he's just gotten in some new cotton cloth. A bunch of it. So he records the kind of cloth, how much it's worth, how much he has. So it becomes a stock book, an inventory book, and a family Bible. And then one last one, please, Melissa. This is the marriage of their daughter. That woman whose baptism you just saw, Marie Angélique, marries it when she was 16, 1767, and I moved to the end of this document. The Gutman's book stayed on the East Coast. It is in good shape. You've seen it. This document stayed in the archives in New Orleans. The humidity eats things away. So we have holes in it. But you can see this is the young woman whose baptism was just recorded. That's her signature. She really knew how to write. So the next generation had moved up, and she married a Frenchman, like all the women in her family. Joseph Duforet was from Bordeaux. And you can see that everybody knows how to sign then. And this is when history really gets real for the Gutmans. That generation, which is 1767, the marriage in New Orleans. So let's go back and talk to another set of Gutmans. We're going to start with Kathy, I think. We can manage to get Kathy.
Okay, well, as far as the book
Good.
is concerned, we always knew about this book, and we knew that it was very old because you could see the fraying pages, but until we met Joan, we had no idea how to translate it. There were always guesses that it was the soldier Duforet from the painting that we had, or so there were some guesses that it was a lady's diary, but we couldn't speak French, and it's really historic French. So Joan was able to help us translate it and figure out what it was. And she was able to link the family history in better with this painting.
Let's wait for a minute about the painting. What, you had this book when you were kids. What did you think of? You talked about this book. It was present in your
We always
lives.
said, well, maybe someday we'll get somebody to translate it for us, but we had no idea who would ever do that.
Even as children, you thought about it.
Yes, we were always curious if it was someone's diary or whatever, what it would say, but we had no idea. We could only speculate. It was obviously very old.
Yeah. And my guess is he began it at about the time of their marriage. So it's mid-18th century, continuing for a long time. And then the book was one thing, but then Melissa's also going to show us one last image, which I just love, which is the family portrait, which you saw on the slide introducing this presentation today. Okay. Going to get, and look at these are the people whose signatures you just saw. That's Joseph Duforet from Bordeaux. That's Angélique Rovoil, Marie Daudin's granddaughter, and these are three of their children. So Marie Daudin's great grandchildren in New Orleans. My guess, given the children's age, is that this was painted about 1780. Recording them in New Orleans. And by the way, that daughter has a killer doll. I mean, that's an expensive doll for the period. So they were showing off the fact that they have a big united family. It's a great portrait of a nuclear family. So think about it, from the docks in Orleans, within much under a century, you have a family in New Orleans in great prosperity, able to have a portrait painted. That's just unbelievable. And maybe Kathy can tell us some more, or any of you, anything about the portrait that you want to add, and it's present in your lives.
Well, my grandmother, after my grandfather died, my grandmother moved into an apartment, and it wasn't a very big apartment, but she had this painting. And it was very dominant because it's about 6 feet by 5 feet.
Oh, wow. I haven't seen it.
Huge painting. And, so we always remembered that, but it's very dark because it needs to be restored, I guess. But then my mother had it in our living room. And we always speculated, about this family. We knew it was a Duforet family, but we didn't know exactly who they were, how they fit into this. So, Joan helped us figure this out with her knowledge and with reading this book. And, my mother and her siblings used to play with this painting. Sometimes they would take it out of the frame and play games through the frame, jumping in and out of it. It's lucky it survived, but all these years later, it's here.
And think about it, the document in the archives is heavily damaged. The book that stayed with the family is in perfect shape. It's ironic, right? That you've done a better job preserving archival documents than a museum in this case. So the portrait made it too. And by the way, if the portrait is that big, that's an absolute proof of how well off they were to be able to have that large a portrait done of their family. That's amazing. I can't wait to see that one. Oh, anybody else have anything about the portrait you want to add? Okay, well then, Jack, let's hear from the next generation. We're moving on. This is Kathy's son, Jack, who will be 8th generation of Mahi Daudin's descendants.
Yep, that's right, Joan.
Yeah. How does this family history still have meaning for you in your generation, for you and for your generation?
Yeah, I mean, of course it does. Like people mentioned, I went to Tulane, so I lived in New Orleans for 4 years. And, everyone would come down and visit, but even at home, you can see, the rest of my family is very passionate about it, which I think is contagious. And, it's educational for me. And, in New Orleans, you can kind of feel the history. So, knowing there's a connection there, it makes it pretty special. And then, you know, like Patricia mentioned, my grandma was stationed there. Actually, even on my father's side, my grandpa worked there. My dad went to LSU. So it feels like maybe a little bit more than a coincidence. Like we have a special connection to New Orleans, which is great. And I'm proud to have gone to Tulane and lived there and kind of continue that.
Did you choose Tulane in part because of the family history, do you think?
I think it was on our radar partially in part, you know, and yeah, it definitely played a factor. It wasn't the driving decision, but it probably got it on the map.
Okay. And have you walked on Bourbon Street since you knew about Mahi Doda?
Yeah, I guess I have. I don't know which building exactly it would be now. So I don't know if I want to know what's in there now.
Yeah, a lot of it.
It's the Omni, right?
That's one of the ones.
Oh, the Omni. That's good.
That's one of the ones that La Roche, her daughter, owned. I mean, this family owned major real estate in New Orleans. We haven't gone into that. I'll send you a map about that, Jack.
Cool.
Who do you think in your generation will be the keeper of the family history?
I think it's tough to say. I think, you know, we have some great examples and a really great foundation to go off of. I think, you know, all of my siblings have some interests, and you know, it might be me. It could be my brother Bart. I think it's more likely we have two than none. So
okay, good. You're a diplomat. First thing necessary, I would think, to be the keeper of the history. Well, it's great to have you here today with us. And then John, maybe we could talk about the brother and the Gutman family. You could talk about your family's history today, your view of it, now that you know that Mahi Daudin has taken her place in it.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. Like everybody else in our family, I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans over the years. I've been down there for work many, many times, as well as for other reasons. And it just amazes me to think that I spent a fair amount of time walking the streets where Marie Daudin and her daughter and her granddaughter lived, and helped build this early city. You know, somebody mentioned the Omni as a piece of real estate that the family owned. I will own up to having been into Lafitte's blacksmith shop, a bar in the French Quarter, which sits on the site of one of the family homes. And these are all things that there's kind of a richness to it that all has come out as a consequence of the book. The second thing I would say is, in many ways, we're kind of a quintessential American family. You know, we now know that our earliest ancestor to come here came on a ship from France, 1719, 1720, a young woman who had literally nothing when she got here. And this is beyond the scope of the presentation, but it's other pieces of the family history. We know that one of Marie's descendants married an Irishman who had come in 1862 and settled in New Orleans, ironically, to work in the port. So there's kind of, it circles back to that. Our mother was a Kelly, and this was the first Kelly, Patrick Milton Kelly. One of their descendants, one of his descendants, our mother, married the son of two immigrants from Austria, who came as teenagers in 1914 during the boom from Ellis Island, or into Ellis Island. Again, from people from towns in Europe who came with nothing. And so here we are sitting here, all of us in 2022, living in different places, you know, doing quite well, focusing on our family's history. And it all goes back to Marie Daudin and her amazing journey and what she accomplished. So my sisters and I, the four of us, Jack and his siblings and cousins, we all owe it to her. That's where it starts. And it just has, knowing all of this has added kind of a richness to all of our lives.
Thank you. This is the kind of thing I think I'm so glad to have that John has said this, because my biggest surprise since the book came out 6 months ago was hearing, I said to you when I did it, I had no idea if there were descendants. Would I hear from any? And I've heard from so many people who describe a connection to women sent out, deported from France in 1719 and still feeling moved by their stories. And for me, that's incredibly important. This deep sense of the Frenchness of this country. Do any Gutmans have anything you'd like to add before we move? I want to say a couple of things in closing and then turn it over for questions.
You know, I'd like to add that when my
Sure.
mother was stationed in New Orleans, you know, she went to all the restaurants and traveled the streets. And the first time that we went down there, or that I went to New Orleans with Mary, with her, yes, my mother, Carmelite Kelly Gutman, and Mary Lou, we were going to see Jack's oldest brother, the first one at Tulane. And she took us to every haunt, every street that when she was there during World War II, you know, before, you know, on the way to the Pacific, we went to all the restaurants, we went to different bars, you know, we went everywhere. Mary Lou could attest, we went to the archives. I don't remember the name of that place, Mary Lou, but to look up her history, to look up names on ships of people that came over.
Yeah. And that's why I think, sorry,
it's ingrained in us now.
I just want to say that's why, you know, we tried to do a lot. And that's why, Joan, thank you for all the time you've spent with us and for the book and all the research. I know for our family and probably all the other families that have read the book, it's really so meaningful. It almost makes me cry when I read the book. So thank you, Joan.
Thank you. And I'm really grateful to the Gutmans for being here today. As I said, it was such a surprise to hear from so many descendants. And there's other surprises too. There was a surprise that, look at the Gutmans, New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. I have heard from descendants, direct descendants of women on that ship who were traveled with Mahi Doda, who live all over this country, north to south, east to west. I could never have predicted that. So to have descendants, I knew there'd be some descendants in Louisiana, Texas, etc., but to have them in New York, New Jersey, and all, that was a surprise for me. Another surprise was learning how many of the descendants, this should have been obvious to me, no longer seem French on the surface. I mean, Gutman and Vukoski, etc., they're not the biggest French names you can imagine. And so many descendants who write me, some have French names, but so many, and some still have the names of the husband of the woman who was deported on the ship, but most have names from all over Europe, American names, a real American family, as John said. And so what is this experience has been for me, the reaction to the book and by people who read it has been to learn that this country is much more French than I thought. That we have roots, French roots that are deeper and wider than I'd ever imagined. And I want to thank the Gutmans for showing us that their family history lives on still as part of their family life, and thank them for speaking for these descendants from all over the country who've written to describe their emotions at reading about the women who founded dynasties that still live on today. And finally, I want to say this, I strongly suspect that either someone listening today or someone who will listen to this will be there. Among those people, there will be individuals who are descended from a woman deported on this ship from France in 1719 who just don't know it yet. There are so many descendants who are not yet aware. The Gutman family had it easy. People were passing down the story, but and even they didn't know about Mahi Daudin. But think of all the people who didn't have keepers of the family history and have had breaks in that history. I'm convinced there's a lot more. So the Descendants Society will grow is what I think, in other words. So anyway, thank you all for doing this, and let's see if we have questions, because the questions might be for the Gutmans too. And Melissa and Isabel are going to take care of that. We stop working.
Merci beaucoup, Joan. We do have a question that reflects what you were just talking about. Peelet says, my family's from places like South Mississippi, New Orleans, and even Mobile, Choctaw. How would you recommend one finding a generational researcher to see if we are descendants of these women?
Okay, well, the first thing I would suggest is you have family names. You know the names of your, that have been passed down through the generation. I would suggest really looking through my book, because I don't do every generation. I couldn't do that for so many women, but I list all the names of the men who married these women, the names of their children, some of their husbands. Read and see if any names mean something to you, because you can easily find that a touch and then realize that you have a connection at some point to one of them. That's, I would suggest, as a starting point. But from down there, if you're not a descendant, you will have a connection to one of the women. Your ancestors would have been in contact with them. That's virtually guaranteed. I am not a direct descendant. I was so glad. I kept worrying when I was doing this. I would think, oh no, I don't want to be a direct descendant, because everyone will say, she's biased. But in no time at all, I wish I could go get my document and bring it in. It's in the next room, and maybe if there's a minute, I will get it. I have restored something one of my aunts gave me, passed on to me, which is a marriage contract, the kind of document we've been seeing. And the person being married is the daughter of a man who was witness to all kinds of marriages of descendants. So he knew them well, because they asked him to stand up for him when they married. So the connections are all over the place, in other words.
We have a question from Karen. She asks, have any of the Gutmans present had DNA testing and gone through ancestry.com or something similar to that
document?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have it. I haven't done it. Oh, sorry, John.
No, I was going to say, to my knowledge, I haven't done it, the DNA testing, and to my knowledge, none of my sisters have, but we are active on ancestry.com and some of the other similar sites, building out family trees on both sides of our family. We're fortunate on the other side, on our father's side, that we still have connections with our relatives in Europe, one of whom I see in a little box on my screen now. He's actually here, a cousin, but who's on the Gutman side. And we knew something about the Irish. This whole experience the last year is building out, as we said, our understanding of the French. But so we're doing stuff on Ancestry, but we haven't done the DNA thing yet.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. I have a question for you. Knowing that you had French roots, did some of you travel to France, especially in Orléans, to see where everything started?
They didn't know Marie Dauda.
Well, at the time we did go to France 2 years ago because my daughter was there for junior year abroad or a semester abroad. But, and we did go to Orleans, but we had no idea
Yeah.
of
At
the
this
connection
time.
at that point.
I'll send you to the parish church when you go back.
Yes.
So you can see the archives there. I can trace her life. They lived
yeah.
really right by the port.
Wow.
And then this is what I was given as a keeper of. It's a document that was in Louisiana, so it has holes from the humidity all over the place. But this is in that one marriage contract. I brought it so that the person who asked the question would know there are 2 names of people, of families of descendant of women deported. So there were 3 families of deported women united at the signing of one document. They really were all over the place down there. It would stun me if someone's family goes back a long ways if there weren't direct connections.
I think we've all been to France.
Mhm.
I love Paris and the countryside. And Mary Lou actually took my parents over to France. The first time I went to New Orleans, I thought to myself, I didn't say anything out loud, this is where I want to retire. And the next year when we went back with my mother, Mary Lou and myself, I told them, I said, I would love to live here. I feel like I come to life. And the other place that I would love to live would be France. I went there when I got out of college. I quit my first job out of college and I went to France and I traveled all over Europe. And France in particular is one of my favorite countries, Paris. And we went over to see Kelly during that semester. And Jack and his girlfriend Ashley and Mary Lou and I and Kelly, we had our Thanksgiving dinner pre-COVID, the November of 2019 over in France. It was an exciting time, I think, for all of us.
So you have this connection, you can feel it.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
Yeah.
I'll say I have been to France a number of times, but I've been to Orleans. But that was probably 30 years ago, and I had no idea of any of this. So now I need to go back.
Well, it strikes me that we should organize, as someone was suggesting in the chat, something at Orleans. I'm convinced the city would be proud to know that one of the women from Orleans sent the only one from Orleans to New Orleans, had left such a heritage and such a family that they'd be thrilled to see you. And the church archives could be open to you. It's the kind of thing I think it could be meaningful for people in the city.
We have Elizabeth Ziffer in the audience. She's the president of the Alliance Française in Gainesville, Florida. And she says that she has a friend in Orleans who might be excited to meet you if you visit the city.
Wow.
Oh, we love it. And we can bring our cousin who's on from my father's side who speaks French fluently.
Help us, yeah. Or Joan, you could come.
Yeah, we'll have an Orleans party. Orleans is a lovely city. And one of the things when COVID, I stopped, as the Gutmans know, I had to just stop doing research because I knew if I wouldn't be able to travel at first, and if I waited, I might never write it. But I had planned a trip to Orleans to dig. A lot of their archives were destroyed in World War II, but I wanted to make one last chance to see anything I could find there. So, any other questions for people?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
Pilit says, are there any connections with these women to Marc-Antoine Caillot, a company man?
Right. This is a wonderful book. If people don't know it, he left memoirs that were translated and edited by Aaron Greenwald, who's down with the Louisiana National Organization for the Humanities. Sorry, I'm blanking. I don't switch from French organizations to American ones so easily. And they undoubtedly knew each other, but they were no intermarriage at that time.
Okay.
We have somebody from the Alliance Française of DuPage who's actually referencing another book of yours, Joan, The Essence of Style. And she's actually working to do an event with her Alliance Française on that book.
Okay, well, tell them that they would be interested, I think, in the Gutman book. The Gutman family in New Orleans, and so they were Gutmans, right? Daudin, the moment when the Daudin family is becoming the Gutman family, if we can say, those years in New Orleans, those people were the trendsetters. They ran the notion stores. So they sold all the best fabrics, laces, accessories. That's another reason in that portrait, she's so well dressed, right? Because she has access to all of this through the family business. And that's why in his account book, paper was really scarce and valuable in New Orleans. So a baptism only takes part of a page, and he wanted to give each person their page, which I think is admirable. So he has his page, his daughter has a page, etc. But you don't waste all that paper. So he notes all those fabrics, and you get a sense of a fashionable life in New Orleans. And these women, look, they'd come from France. They were young women in France in a world where people dressed well and knew fabrics. Some of them are extraordinary. Some of the deported women, in the documents they left about when they asked them to say what's in their homes, boy, do they care about fabrics. They mentioned the types of clothing, the colors, the fabrics. So they were the essence of style for the Gulf Coast, in my opinion, in the 1720s and 30s and 40s.
We have another 2 or 3 minutes. If anybody else has any other questions.
Anything else from a Gutman? If not, yeah, okay.
Well, I see the comment, love your website with the interactive map.
Yeah.
And so I'll go there and say that's what, and there's a link to it in our the URL is in a footnote in the book, but it's fantastic because it tells you where in the city they all lived, all the addresses where, and for our family, where Marie Daudin lived, where her daughter lived, where her granddaughter lived, but it's true of many of them. And it's just a terrific thing. So it's just fantastic.
We don't have it, so it would take too long, the question, to pull it up, given our time limit. I also went to Tulane as an undergraduate, to Newcomb College, the college for women at the time. And I've often gone back to lecture, so I know New Orleans well. And I grew up in Louisiana, so I had a connection. But the time I went back to, I was lecturing at the Art Museum in New Orleans on Paris and New Orleans in 1719. And I was already working on the book. And I went through the French Quarter photographing the homes on the sites where women had lived in the 1720s. And when I was doing that, at one point, Bourbon Street, the French Quarter, some of you, if you know it, has some unusual people in the streets at times, right? And so I am there with my camera, very moved, photographing houses, and so pleased. People were acting like I was the crazy person. They were drunks falling down the street, no problem. But this woman photographing houses and with tears in her eyes, that was what was strange. So it was that moment that I decided to do the map, to show people how much of the French Quarter, this place where tourists go first off, was in the hands of these women. So women who had nothing, like Mahi Doda, they were the authorities who sent them to Louisiana called the merchandise. They show up in a document as merchandise for Louisiana. So that merchandise ended up owning the capital. And I think that's not bad as revenge goes in life. So anyway, thank you so much to all the Gutmans, and thank you to the Alliance and to everyone who attended. And I hope we find new descendants. Oh God, no. Mention Ship Island. No, I can't. Anyway, thank you all. It's been a lot of fun talking to you, and I hope the descendants continue to stay in touch. And thank you. And Jack, good luck with that next generation, keeping it in line.
Yeah, thank you,
Yes.
John.
Thank
To everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
It was a
Thank you.
pleasure
Bye.
to share this story
Bye.
with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.